Right now, our political commentators, and there's a bit about today. We welcome Sue Moroney and Peter Dunne. Kia ora kōrua.
Kia ora.
Morena, Catherine.
Sue is a former MP with the Labour Party, now Chief Executive of Community Law Centres Aotearoa. Peter Dunne was the leader of United Future and is a former MP and Minister who's worked in governing arrangements with both National and Labour. Right, what happened last week, in the middle of the week? Some are seeing it as a marker point for this government, depending on how things go. It could only be described as a lightning move on pay equity claims, pushed through under urgency, no select committee, no regulatory impact statements, or so forth, and very little forewarning, even of the government's own MPs, it seems, until the weekend before. So there's the process, and then there's the reason for it. What did you make of it all, Sue?
Well, yeah, look, there's a lot going on in that space. It's not surprising that this is what the National-led government did, but it's shocking, if that makes sense. It's shocking that they did it so quickly and with such little process that now they really only have themselves to blame as they're out and about now saying, oh, it's completely misunderstood. No one's understood it properly. Well, that's kind of what happens when you do things on the hop like this. And, you know, as a government, I think they've started out their term, you know, they first of all upset people with disabilities by cutting their funding. They then got, you know, the whole of tangata whenua offside with their backing or their allowance of the Treaty Principles Bill to go through first reading. But now this is women. Women are the majority. So marginalising the majority in our country, not only women, but also the men who work in those low-paid, female-dominated industries. You know, this is actually really big for the ballot box. And I think they've possibly started to understand that now, but they've already gone through this process where they have not given anyone the ability to engage with it. And now they're trying to recreate the narrative, but nothing can hide the fact that there are, by their own accounts, some billions of dollars that will come out of the pay packets and the food tables of low-paid women and their families and go back into the government budget instead. I'm
just looking at some of these 33 active claims, because some have been settled, of course, but among them include access community nurses, care support workers in different categories, kindy admin, librarians are in there, hospice nurses and healthcare assistants, and so forth. Peter, was that rush necessary?
No, I think there are two issues, or two sides to this issue, really. First of all is what they did in terms of the changes that they made. And there's an arguable case there, I think, that some clarification around a number of the provisions was required. The second, though, is the process by which they did it. Now, it seems to me, if you're going to make a major change like this, even if you're going to do it under urgency, and I'll come to that point in a moment, but you sow the ground first. I hadn't heard any speeches from ministers over the preceding weeks about issues with pay equity. I hadn't heard any warnings that there might be change in the wind or suggestions where the system wasn't working, etc., etc. Normally you would expect that, so that when the legislation emerges, everyone says, oh, so that's what they were talking about, okay. But to suddenly have it dropped, ministers only getting notice over the weekend, caucus I'm not sure exactly when, I think that followed. This is the classic story of of governments that just use urgency as a blunt weapon. So the political problems that have emerged from it are entirely of their own making. They could have been avoided had they attempted to do some sort of a sell on what they were proposing to do in advance, even if for strategic reasons they may have then decided to move with it under urgency. I think urgency is a problem in itself. Do you buy the
argument that there would have been all these claims lodged and settled if they took even a few short weeks for urgency?
No, I don't. And in fact, what they could have done, because I think there will be issues that arise in the legislation that will have to be tidied up anyways. They could have done what both governments have done previously, is bring in a bill under urgency, send it to a select committee for even a week just to have a cursory glance at the major issues before passing it. But that's all gone completely. No public input at all. And as a consequence, a sort of a shell-shocked population in a sense that of betrayal. Now, they've got to deal with the consequences of that.
How helpful to have your coalition partner off saying they've just saved the budget with this while you're trying to deny that that's what it's about, Sue?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, the coalition partners are not talking with each other about strategy, quite obviously. But also it happens to be true. I mean, I think that the fact that this is about saving money, it's not about just a small tweak. It will mean that, if it was about a small tweak, then they would not have gone retrospective. I actually think that combination of doing this under urgency, but also making it retrospective, those two things, when you're doing legislation, are rare. Both of them are rare, and you put them together, and it just makes the government look panicky. But also means that people are very concerned about what the motivation has been for this. And then you get your coalition partner coming out and saying, "Look, we've just saved billions over the next few years for the budget. We've saved the budget." Well, of course people are going to, and you see all the placards quite rightly saying, give tax cuts to landlords and take money off the low paid, because that's what's clearly going on. But it's no surprise, because that's what right-wing governments do. So now they've put that right in the face of the electorate. And what I'm hearing is that women and their families who generally don't engage with politics and aren't really thinking about what's going on, they're incensed by this move by the government. So it really is. And you talked, Catherine, about the types of claims that are now being cancelled and the people who that's affecting. They quite often are middle ground voters. They're swing voters, and this is going to swing them quite clearly against the government at the ballot box.
As the government now tries to do some retrospective explaining, it could have had more time for if it had done things differently. Some points to note. You can't both save the billions and then say, yes, but they can all file these claims and imply they're all going to go through. You're either not going to have to pay that money out, which means some of these claims are going to fail, or some that may have succeeded are going to fail, or eventually you are going to have to pay it out, which just means I don't know how this is landing in terms of the government's contingency budget, but either they're pruning that contingency budget for now on claims that may ultimately succeed, or that money's never going to make its way where it would have. You can't have it both ways, Peter.
Well, I think they're buying a bit of time for themselves on that by saying that I heard the Prime Minister say this morning that he's expecting a new system in place by the end of the year. He wants to move quickly, but by the end of the year. So they're buying themselves a little bit of time in terms of this year's budget. I think there's also an assumption
it's still going to come back, though.
Oh, sure, of course it is. These things do. But there's also an assumption in there being made generally that the 33 claims that were live at the time that they were extinguished would have all succeeded. I don't know whether that's true or not. So I think there's a sort of a juggle here. But again, it comes back to not having had the facts set out before the situation occurred. We don't quite know what we're dealing with.
There's another point. Again, as we're talking about misinformation or, scaremongering or anything else, which is now being discussed, that full $17 billion that's being talked about wasn't all for pay equity, right? A portion of it would have been for pay equity, and we have to guess what that is, Sue.
Well, that's right, because there has been no regulatory impact statement. We don't know what the cost is. That's allowed ACT to come out and say, it's us, we've saved all these billions from the budget, and the government actually can't respond to it because, Peter's quite right. We don't know how many of those claims would have been accepted, but that's the point. Those claims have been in train now for years, actually. Some of those claims would have taken more than a year to have worked up to have got to the stage that they're at now, and we'll never know what the outcome of those claims would have been under the current regime. As I said before, going retrospectively on this is very, very...
One further point about the potential impact of this, and you've made the point that women are half of, slightly over half the population, I think, typically, but around half the population. There will be an assumption that many of the people most directly affected here are not likely regular national voters or national voters at all, and I choose national deliberately because I think they're the ones who are most in the spotlight for this. I had a look at the Roy Morgan numbers, which, and I'm doing it from memory, I apologise, had National down again around 29%, I think, for female vote overall. But then I had a look, Sue, at Labour's support amongst male voters at the 2023 election, and it was even worse. There seems to have been at the last election, and is currently, a bigger gender skew than there was in the time of John Key or perhaps even Helen Clark. When does this really matter? Does it really matter when the skew is not balanced out, male vote versus female vote?
Well, look, I think on this particular issue, I would make the point again that it is women, but it's not just women. It's also men working in those female-dominated industries. So while it seems gender-specific, it's not particularly. However, when you look at the polls, there's quite a few different things going on. There's something going on about age as well. So what we see in some of the polls is that young men are actually switching their votes to Labour, the Greens, Te Pāti Māori versus older men, and younger women are switching their votes in much larger numbers to the left wing than the right wing. So it's not just about gender, there's an age thing going on as well, and I think that's tied up with some of the other issues that the government has been getting themselves offside with the population about as well. So look, it does matter around when it comes to the ballot box, and I know this because I know that's why the government actually changed it. The national government changed its stance on paid parental leave all those years ago, and the extension of that, because they knew how important getting women to vote for them was at the polls at that particular election.
I think there will inevitably be some political blowback for the National Party on this, but I'm not persuaded necessarily that it will be long term, because I think these things have a sort of a wave effect to them. There'll be something else that will come along. And I also just note that if you do, as I do, a rolling average of polls over a long period of time, the coalition has been in front, except for a few months at the beginning of this year and a few weeks after Chris Hipkins took over in 2023. It's been in front since 2021. The gap has narrowed a little bit, but it's still pretty consistent. So while this could easily shift it, and we'll see that over the next month or so, I suspect, the government, I think, will be hoping that whatever it brings out in the budget and whatever else happens in the meantime offsets that loss to some extent. It may not do it entirely, but enough. It's the old story. Even though we've got a proportional system, when it comes to winning government, it's still 50% plus one.
All right. Okay, let's have a look at some of the things that passed. And one of the most significant bills for some people that passed, although it seems dry as old biscuits to other people, was the Regulatory Standards Bill passing. Just a quick hit on your view in this and whether it imposes on the public sector a particular requirement, Peter, that you do take issue with.
I think there's something terribly ironic about saying we want to free up regulatory responses and have a freer and more open environment, and we're going to legislate to achieve that. I think there's a certain sort of freedom by compulsion doesn't seem to me to go quite well. I'm sceptical about it. I recall, and I'm sure Sue does as well, a former mutual colleague of ours, Ross Robertson, who in the late 1980s introduced the Paperwork Reduction Bill, and the amount of paperwork that was required to comply with the legislation outweighed any benefit from it. And I fear this is going to be exactly the same thing with the Regulatory Standards Bill. Good idea in theory, but I doubt its practicality its practicality in reality.
Sue?
Yeah, not just the paperwork involved, but actually we're reducing regulation by setting up a new entity to monitor how that regulation goes.
We've got a whole ministry.
It is same old. But look, in some ways, I know many people regard this as being more dangerous than the Treaty Principles Bill, because it actually undermines quite an important value that we've had in New Zealand over many, many decades by prioritising property rights over everything else when you look at regulation. And that's quite a substantial move for this country. I don't think it is something dry and boring on paper. It actually has the ability to completely change the way that this country considers itself to regulate and to legislate.
Except there's still the Bill of Rights in place, and the Bill of Rights has always
ignored
been
all the time, Peter.
Yes, I know it is, but there's always been this issue about whether we should bring property rights into the Bill of Rights, and that's always been resisted. Even though it gets ignored in practice so many times, I think the Regulatory Standards Bill's in that same category, sort of a nice to have, but generally bypass when you need to.
The Waitangi Tribunal review has also been announced, its scope and its reach, at the very time it's considering the Regulatory Standards Bill. But again, and this has got a bit to unfold, again, is this the coalition just rolling out what it says it was going to do?
Yeah, I guess that's one way of looking at it. But actually, Parliament meddling with the judiciary is actually quite a serious issue, and reviewing the Waitangi Tribunal falls into that category. So it actually really, again, is quite a serious attack on the way in which this country has done its business in the past. And again, lining up with all those other things that we've talked about, people with disabilities, women, tangata whenua, this is starting to look more and more like the US agenda rolling out.
I think Sue's inadvertently put her finger on what might be the problem. The coalition certainly promised a review of the tribunal, which is now 50 years old in its election manifesto, so yeah, it's doing what it said it was going to do. But I think the concern that it's addressing is one that, whether you like it or not, is felt in substantial quarters of the population, that the tribunal has gone way beyond what was initially intended. And the implication that it has some sort of judicial independence in terms of not the matters referred to it, but the matters it chooses to follow, I think is at the core of the concern. So I think a useful debate to have, and this would have been a far more profitable debate actually than the treaty principles debate turned out to be, is about the role and purpose of the Waitangi. I'm getting tongue-tied here, of the Waitangi Tribunal. Is it still fit for purpose in terms of its original objectives? If not, how do they need to be amended?
And there are always historical claims and contemporary claims as part of its suite of responsibilities. The thing is that the government is not bound to follow any of its recommendations.
Yeah, and I think that's an issue. If you can't, it seems to me, talk about its judicial independence on the one hand, if on the other the government can say, well, we don't accept that recommendation, or we do. So I think there are a lot of issues there that need to be unpacked. Now, whether the review is going to do that, or it's going to be a cheap and nasty part of a sort of a New Zealand First version, because that's where this initiative comes from, of the Treaty Principles Bill, I think we'll see over the next few months.
All right. I get all these sort of the dry stuff out because it is substantive stuff. And then we saw a flurry very quickly at the weekend, as can sometimes happen. So if there's an unpopular story not running well, the social media proposed ban for under 16s was a members' bill as of last Wednesday, and was then pretty quickly elevated to not quite being at the point of a government bill, but certainly now officials investigating it. To be honest with you, Sue, if Labour wanted to come in and support it, they could get it out of the cake tin under new rules as soon as this week. What are you making of it practically and also as a political issue?
Yeah, I think the weekend was very interesting. It looked to me like a government under pressure, recognising that they had made some very large blunders and that they needed some other distractions to come along pretty quickly and take up the space. And I think their stance on the ban for under 16s falls into that category, along with the boy races agenda that they raised out of nowhere again on the weekend as well. Look, it's interesting because, nothing screams more nanny state than a supposed ban on under 16s and what they can and can't do with social media. And, National has always been the party that has levelled that particular criticism at Labour, and here they are being the most nanny state of all. So quite interesting from that perspective. Don't know if it's workable. And I think that's, they'll spend the next 18 months asking themselves whether it's workable or not, but looking like that they're doing something. And that's what they're planning to do all the way through to the polls, to make it look like they care about this issue and they're going to do something serious, when in fact it's probably not too much that can be done in that space.
Begins as a members' bill, but as we said, and I think the Prime Minister at the time issued, signalled support for it and said, there's the possibility of it becoming a government bill at some point. It's not quite there, but boy, that prospect was raised very quickly within a few days.
Yeah, and it's the old political story. Never ask a question until you know the answer. And I don't think they know the answer. They've raised the question now. And Sue makes an interesting point when she talks about this over the next 18 months. I think there's some truth in what she says, but there's a complicating factor. This is based on what's going on in Australia, the South Australian legislation, which will take another year to implement. So the risk is, if you leave the issue to one side, the risk for the government seems to me to be it proceeds down a path of we're going to legislate, da-da-da-da-da, while over the Tasman, all of the pitfalls about legislating and how effective it can be to enforce, etc., are becoming obvious. So I think they've got a potential collision sometime to come. The question that really needs to be asked is where does the responsibility lie here? And I think fundamentally the responsibility lies with parents, actually, in terms of governing their children's behaviour. For those that aren't able to or unwilling to do so, I'm not sure that the state leaping in and saying, well, we'll do it for you, is necessarily the best way. And no one's ever, as far as I'm aware, given a credible argument as to how if you restrict access by account to under 16s, how you prevent them using someone else's account.
Okay, let's have a look at one final point that may have a relevance here to the sort of the theme of the day, which was when the party donations were released. It was interesting talking to David Parker this morning about his attempts to get a so-called wealth tax or a broader capital gains tax over the line in 2023 it was, and the ruling out of that by the then leader Chris Hipkins saw him step aside as Revenue Minister. And when he works through it this morning, you see a comparatively small number of people most directly affected, and not a big broad base of, as I said, baby boomers who may have got their mortgage paid off but are still staring down the barrel of quite a long retirement and quite high rising costs. It was a comparatively limited number of people. But depending on your politics, they may be funders of your party. What did you make of the release of the funding details and who's funding whom? Sue, that was to you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, always revealing, actually, when you see those donations. And it is an ongoing issue in our country that we have disproportionate influence from funders on our politics, and that has become very apparent with this current coalition government. I think in previous times it has been less obvious, it's been much more subtle, but you look at the way that National, New Zealand First and ACT have behaved in this particular term of government, and they don't even seem too worried to express that yes, they are doing the bidding of the gun lobby, and yes, that they are deriving funding from them. So it's a very worrying part of the development in our political system, in my view.
4.8 million National is the biggest recipient got, according to the party's returns published by the Electoral Commission last Monday, and Labour drawing 1.6 million in donations.
Yeah, and you could draw all sorts of conclusions from that, validly or invalidly, about relative levels of support. I mean, National clearly has some very big and wealthy donors. And the question, I suppose, that always goes through one's mind when you look at these things is whether they donate because they like what's happening, or whether they donate because they want to get to like what's happening, in other words, by influencing it. And I think it's a bit of both. But the point, I think, is that these things have been the practice for many years, and governments, the political side of governments, have tended to try and stay at arm's length from the donors so that they don't necessarily know or feel there's too much close contact. That seems to be changing now, and there seems to be, certainly within, I think, New Zealand First and to some extent ACT and possibly National as well, a much more overt sense of he who pays the piper calls the tune. And I think that's the worrying side. Now, the counterbalance to that is we do have more accountability and transparency today about who's donating and how much they're donating. But the bigger question in my mind is, so if you didn't have a donations regime, who funds the political parties? And I get really wary when people say, the state should fund the political parties, because that to me would be total anathema.
Whether or not it's kind of a direct influence, and I don't think people are implying something that would be in breach of the law necessarily, the policies that are likely to be popular with a certain cohort and those that are unpopular, which cycles back to the decisions, the tough choices, quote unquote, that finance ministers make when putting together budgets, for examples. And it is also to do with the respective political parties and who they infer their supporters are going to be.
I don't think in either this government or the previous Labour-led government. I think it's far too crude to say that A sort of rocked up and said, "Oh, look, do this." I don't think that's the case at all.
But I don't think it's absence from a politician's mind the impact of their policies.
No, and I think there's a sort of a funny process goes on. On the one hand, you think, who's this going to impact, and in the negative sense, and on the other hand, it's who's going to benefit from this that we might then be able to go and sort of tap on the shoulder for funding. So that's sort of a relationship. But I think the only answer is daylight. Making sure that the information's out there, we can see what's happening, and people can draw their conclusions accordingly.
Thank you both very much. Sue, sorry, go ahead.
I just wouldn't discount the issue of state funding. I think it does actually mean that there's much more even field, and that the voters are actually protected by that. So I think that's still an open discussion.